Alright, welcome to the next video. This video is focused on explaining how to use VEXcode to create codes for your VEX IQ robot. Now, this video does assume that you're already familiar with the sensor board that we use in this tutorial. It also assumes that you already know how to hook up the wires to the sensor board. If you don't know either of those things, then go to the very first video in this series and that'll explain where to start off. So let's go ahead and first set up all of our sensors. We're going to be using two sensors today, the touch LED and the bumper sensor. And you can see here on my screen, I already have both of those set up inside of the devices menu. All right, with that, let's go ahead and jump in and get started. Let's start by looking at our first task. All right, so our first task is to figure out how many times has this bump sensor been pressed since we started the program. So how are we going to keep track of that? Well, we can go to sensing to see if there's a built-in way to keep track of how many times it's been pressed. So when I'm going to go over to sensing, I'm going to go to bump sensor, and I see that the only bump sensor is bump sensor pressed. And so since this is a Boolean, it's a hexagon shaped, all it's going to do is tell me, is it being pressed present right now? But how do I keep track of how many times the bump sensor's been pressed? What could I use inside of VEXcode to keep track of information? Do you have any ideas? Take a second, look through VEXcode, see if you can come up with a good solution. What we're going to use is called a variable. So what exactly is a variable? A variable is a named piece of storage that stores data for later use in the program. So what exactly does that mean then? Imagine a variable like a brain cell. And this brain cell is able to keep up with exactly one piece of information. We're going to give the brain cell a name, and then whenever we want to find out what that brain cell is holding, we can ask it, hey brain cell, what is your piece of information that you're remembering? And it's going to tell you. So that's essentially what a variable is. If you've ever played a video game that has coins or money, and as you go through the video game you collect coins or money, there's a variable that's keeping track of how much coins or how much money that you've accumulated throughout the video game. So let's go ahead and make our own variable. We're going to come over here to the left and click Variables. And you're going to see a button that says Make a Variable. Now, we need to name this variable. The name of the variable is important because it needs to be something that's logical, something that tells us what is this piece of data that is being remembered. I'm going to call this piece of data bump count. So bump count is going to keep track of how many times that bump sensor has been pressed. So now let's go ahead and make it work. Now you're going to see when started. Let's go ahead and drag this variable block that says set bump count to 0. We're going to go ahead and put it right there. So why did we put it right there? Well, essentially, whenever the program starts, we have to tell what is the variable starting at. And since the program's just started and no one's pushed the bump sensor yet, we're just going to start it at 0 because it's not been pressed at all. So now let's come over here to events and let's grab when bump pressed. Let's go back to variable and grab change bump count by 1. Perfect. So let's look at what we have. When started, set the variable bump count to 0. And when bump is pressed, change the bump count by 1. What change the bump count by 1 means is whatever the bump count was before, add 1 to it. Now this will be functional, but there's no way for us to know what is bump count set to. So I could come by and press this several times. I might want to know, like, what is the current value of bump count? So how could I show what the current value of bump count is? Well, let's come up here to looks, and let's grab the block that says print VEXcode on brain. Now you're going to notice that VEXcode is an oval. So how could I print the value of bump count onto the brain? Go ahead, pause the video, see if you can do it by yourself. All right, you ready for the answer? Let's go back to variable, and let's grab this little bump count. Do you notice how the bump count is an oval and how the print is an oval? If I drag this and drop it right there, it's now going to print whatever bump count is onto the brain. Perfect. So now I need to connect this. Which way am I going to connect it? Am I going to put it under when started, or am I going to put it under when bumper pressed? So let's think logically through it. If I put this under when started, I'm only going to print bump count once. It's only going to print the value whenever I start the code. But I don't want it to just print once. I want it to print every time the value's increased. So instead, I'm going to drag this block and drop it right here underneath when bump is pressed. Sweet. Looks like we're ready to go ahead and download this to our brain. Go ahead and grab your USB-C and hook it up into the side of your brain. Then you'll see that the download option lights up. Click download, and the code is now on your brain and ready to go. So let's take a look at it. Go ahead and press the check to run the code, and focus really close here on the brain screen. Now you're going to notice that every time I press the bump count, the number appears on the screen. Now there is a little bit of a problem. You see I pressed it twice, and on the screen it shows the number 12. Well, why is that? Well, the answer is it printed a 1 the first time you pressed it, and then it printed a 2 the second time you pressed it. But we didn't tell VEXcode to put any kind of spacing or to put any kind of way to tell the difference between the two numbers. So it printed a 1, and then it immediately printed a 2 the next time I pressed it. And if you press it a third time, you'll see that the 3 pops up. So now it looks like I've pressed it 123 times. So there's a really easy fix for how to fix that. Come over here to looks and grab set cursor. Drop it right there. And what the cursor is going to do is every time it prints, it's going to set the cursor back to the very first line, and that will fix it so it's not constantly printing the old numbers. So go ahead and download that and check it out. You see there's a 1, now there's a 2, a 3, and it's a little bit less confusing. Congratulations, we've finished our first task. As soon as you feel confident in what we've done so far, go ahead and start the next video.